This is lecture 1 in the course on international human rights. It's virtually impossible today, politically, socially, economically, culturally, legally, to ignore the fact that the language of human rights is very much the lingua franca of our time. It's the language we speak when we think of justice, when we think of economics questions, when we think of ecological issues. We basically think of what it means to be human and to live in a minimally meaningful way, both in communities, within states we live in the international order. And so the language of human rights, anyone who's minimally interested in the world they live in, or as they go out to finishing their studies, the language of human rights will be the language which is used in terms of justifying positions, negating positions, but no one can get away from human rights. And so in this course we want to look at a variety of issues around human rights. We want to look at a bit of the history of where did human rights come from, because the language of human rights has not always existed, but it does have a history, usually in other forms and names. We want to look at the philosophy of human rights, because there's the tendency for many people who are outside of the orbit of the first world to see the language of human rights as an imperial liberal invention that undermines other cultures' ways of understanding what the good life is. And so where did the philosophy, even the ideals of human rights come from? And what is the attack on the language of human rights itself? So reflecting on the philosophy and the history of human rights is very important to understand that there are people who do object to the language itself, which doesn't mean they're opposed to justice or peacemaking. They just have different ways of understanding it other than rights language itself. And then once we move from the history of human rights to the philosophy, we want to look up, because merely reflecting on human rights or knowing a bit about the history does not mean that it has any public force or strength. And so inevitably the move from the philosophy and history of rights to the legal nature of rights. So how does the language of rights get embedded in law, whether declarations of human rights, charters of human rights, covenants of human rights? Most states in the world use the language in their legal system of rights. And so that gives people a standard they can appeal to when they feel their rights are violated. They feel their rights are not being properly represented. And so the legal element of rights then gives people not only standards they can appeal to, but courts they can appeal to in terms of when they feel their rights have been violated. And so this next element of the rights, the legal element, is very, very important to understand. Then we'll look at those who monitor human rights, so large non-government organizations. Many years I was involved with Amnesty International, which is one of the largest human rights organizations in the world, Human Rights Watch itself. And so these non-government groups appeal usually to standards at the United Nations, either the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or various covenants and optional protocols, human rights. And when states violate these particular rights, whether first, second, or third world states, there are standards that can be appealed to. And so in that sense, groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, they become the conscience of the world that recognize that the ideals, in terms of philosophically of rights, now have international standards that are recognized by states that belong to the UN. And when those states violate those rights, then there's a standard that can be appealed to, and reports can be written, and one then can go to embassies, consul general's offices, whatever, and say this report has been put together in terms of either the violation of political, civil, legal rights in your country, or violation of economic, social, cultural rights, ecological rights. So once there are organizations who do the monitoring. So not only do we have the history and the philosophy of rights, we have legal standards, but as I mentioned, if that's only the standards that we have, who does the monitoring? And so, but groups then like Amnesty International and other groups, they lack the force to implement rights. So who's then responsible for implementing rights? So Amnesty, for an example, can appeal to a state and say, for example, China's treatment of, or lack of treatment of, meaningful political civil rights was, say, the 1989 Tiananmen Square, or treatment of the Tibetans or Muslims and Christians. Because China belongs to the United Nations, they can appeal to those rights, but there's no guarantee that China, for example, is going to be faithful in upholding those rights, or Saudi Arabia, or Latin American states, and so it's one thing to say there are non-government, intergovernment organizations like the United Nations, which have these standards in place, but there's no guarantee that just because you have legal standards in place, or because you have intergovernment organizations or non-government organizations in place, that states are going to uphold those rights when it threatens their national security. And so there's often a tension then, when we think of human rights, between the national security and economic interests of a state and the higher standard of human rights, which is supposed to transcend state interests. So rights are supposed to, at their best, be a universal, this is why they're called universal rights, that transcend partisan politics within states and transcend state interests in the realm of global politics. But often what happens when there is a clash between national security and economic issues and human rights, sadly so, human rights then often become subordinated to the overarching interests of a state, either domestically or in its foreign policy. So of course in human rights then has to factor in not only the history and growth of the idea of rights, the reflections on rights themselves, the legal documents, which then give standards by which rights can be measured, they can be quantified, by which states can be held account to them. But the dilemma in the world of real politics, and this is where also the clash between idealism and realism collides, the idealism of human rights, which says there are rights that transcend states and partisan politics. And then on the other hand, you get states that, as I mentioned earlier, their national security and economic interests, when they clash with rights, often then subordinates rights, or they justify what they're doing in a way that subordinates rights, or they deny what they're doing. There are various ways that this can take place. But this course is on international human rights, so we'll be looking at various parts of the world in which rights are very much threatened. They're very much being challenged in terms of states which are less concerned with rights than they are about protecting their own interests or forming alliances with other states in the world. So we'll be moving across the terrain of the major regions of the world. We'll be looking at what the situation is like in Russia with Putin. We'll be looking at, obviously, China, looking at the Middle East, and particularly the clashes in the Middle East, the issue of, say, Israel and the Palestinians, what's the issues going on in Iran, the difference between the Shia and the Sunni forms of Islam, their understanding of rights, the whole issues in Africa, various states in Africa where you'll have various right-of-center Muslim groups, their understanding of what it means to have a true caliphate or a true Muslim state, and holding the Quran up for that, and yet what's the relationship of rights in that, the treatment of people in the process, the different states that are very much at war in Africa, the Latin American states at the present time and some of the tensions going on there, Europe itself. And so when we think of international rights, important to understand that the standards that we have in terms of rights are one thing. Realpolitik is quite another, and where you get leaders of states vying for power, often they're quite willing to subordinate rights, often violently, for the purpose of getting into power as well. And of course history is replete with such stories in terms of how what often begins as protest against injustices, those who get in power then become agents of injustice themselves. And so these are very important to reflect upon when we look at international human rights itself. It's one thing to reflect at the theory of rights, the legal element of rights, then the non-government and intergovernment groups, which play an important role in monitoring rights as the conscience, as it were, of the world. And then the tensions they face inevitably with major actors on the stage of world politics, that on the one hand will say, oh yes, human rights are significant, but there are also other factors we have to weigh on the scales of decision making that place human rights in a certain balancing, and sometimes the scales tip in one way more towards security and economic issues rather than rights. Now, when we talk about rights, there are 7 major rights, and out of that there's spokes that often go out of those rights, and often right-of-center governments will highlight certain types of rights, left-of-center governments will highlight other rights. So what's called the first generation of rights highlighted political, civil, and legal rights. And so, for example, the United States or significant parts of Europe, that people should have the right to form political parties, they should have the right to vote, and no one should be forbidden from participating through voting, through forming parties, through belonging to parties, and that should be protected by the state. Civil rights, that people should have the right to gather and protest, freedom of the press, freedom of speech. These are civil rights that usually in first world states, it is the role of the state to protect that. And so, same with law, the legal rights. And so, first generation of rights language very much upheld the importance of states protecting these rights, remembering always that rights and responsibilities always belong together. And some of the culture wars, clashes we're seeing today, people hold high the language of liberty and rights, but they failed to see that certainly within the origins and the development and maturation of human rights, rights and accountability, rights and responsibility belong together. So to uphold one element of rights, i.e. the liberty, the freedom, my right, for example, in this COVID season, my right not to wear a mask, within the rights tradition, there's also the responsibility to others in terms of a community one lives within. And so the danger, of course, of responsibilities without rights is that rights can become, again, marginalized in the process. Now, left-of-center groups, historically, so the Euro-American tradition has tended to hold high, and that's what we call first generation of rights, political, civil, and legal rights. Leftist traditions, so if you can see the rightist traditions coming out of the English European tradition, and the United States being at the forefront of the first generation right-of-center rights. The dilemma with the right-of-center rights is most leftist traditions, elements coming more out of the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, is they argued, yes, a person can have the right to belong to a party, to form a party, to vote, to protest, freedom of speech, freedom of publication. That doesn't mean, or rights to the courts, that doesn't mean a person has a basic standard of living, or wages are adequate, or benefits are in place, or people are employed faithfully and consistently, or adequate housing. And so leftist traditions tended to emphasize much more the social, economic, cultural role of rights and the role of the state in protecting those rights. And at times they would have to minimize political, civil, legal rights. So certainly in the French Revolution, you certainly had in the Russian Revolution, you can see in China today, you can see certain political, civil rights are repressed for the purpose of economic, social, cultural rights. And so in certain Middle Eastern countries as well, so they can provide the basics economically, socially, culturally, but any protest or any dissent, in will come the police and the military quickly. And so two traditions of rights based on how one prioritizes the six major rights: political, civil, legal, social, economic, cultural. The seventh right, which is very much obviously with us today, is ecological rights, given global warming. And so who is responsible for protecting the environment and the human's symbiotic relationship with the environment itself? Is this the role of the state? Is this the role of society? And so within these first and second generation rights, there's a difference on who is responsible for guaranteeing what. Is it the state? So if you're in a right of center tradition, you have the state is responsible for protecting political, civil, legal rights, but it's the role of society and the individual and the community for protecting social, economic, cultural rights. As you move to the left, increasingly so, it is the role of the state in providing social, economic, cultural rights. But they'll often, when you get society tries to protest and wants more, a greater authority or power in the political realm, they'll often be repressed in the process. And we can see again and again in left of center governments the dimming of political, civil, legal rights, but a holding high economic, social, cultural rights. And obviously the environmental rights is very much a central one in our time. And what is the role of state and society and international institutions in putting together documents for that? And again, you have the whole history of the philosophy, ecological issues. You have now conferences and legal documents in place, but what are the non-government, intergovernment organizations that monitor this, and then how are those particular documents embodied in terms of their application in the real world, so that actually we're dealing with the results of global warming and where all of that comes from in terms of big businesses and polluting water, land, and sky. And so animal rights is yet one more thing that has really become on the front burner for many also. And so when we think of international human rights, then there's the history, there's the philosophy, there's the legal documents, there's those groups that monitor intergovernment, non-government, government assistant organizations. And then there's the tensions in terms of how it can be implemented. And this often is where the real rubber hits the road, which we'll be exploring in this course. And then there are the 7 major areas of rights, as I have mentioned, and then how first generation and second generation rights tend to emphasize rights, and they prioritize them differently. And then what is very much before us today is ecological rights that threatens whether people are on the right or the left. It's having a huge implication on people's health and the future of the planet itself. And then animal rights itself. So we'll be exploring some of these issues in this course on international human rights.